Deacon Brett, Jake, welcome to the third edition of Education at the Crossroads. And let me briefly introduce to our audience Jake and Deacon Brett. They both work for the St. Thomas More Academy in North Carolina, a school that I very much love and that I have known now for 10 years. And have visited the school various times, and as both of you know, your school was what inspired me to found the sister school of the St. Thomas More Academy here in Austria, called the Schola Thomas Morus, which has now also already existed for almost 8 years. In fact, we have our first graduating class this year. And so we are very much looking forward to seeing the results of our first group of graduates who are, so to say, the pioneers of our school. So far, it looks very good. They have been doing very well on their examinations that are required here in Austria so far. But let me briefly ask you to start off with this first question, and that you both in education, both teaching at St. Thomas More Academy, and of course you, Deacon Brett, being the headmaster of St. Thomas More Academy and having been involved for a good number of years. My first question to both of you, Deacon Brett and Jake, is what was the moment in your life and why that you felt called to become involved and active in education?
Well, first, Christiaan, it's good to see you, and it's good to get a chance to talk again and see each other. And thanks for this opportunity to come together and talk about our mutual vocations, passions, vocations, love to serve the young people entrusted to our care and to teach them, hopefully inspire them, guide them. In answer to the question for me, it is a long and interesting road. I could certainly say that when I was in high school, I would have never imagined being a teacher, certainly not a deacon, and definitely not a headmaster of a Catholic school. None of those things would have been in my mind. I will say this: I had a really incredible art teacher my senior year in high school who I must give a lot of credit to, is he really changed the direction of my life. And in many ways, I think was a real instrument of God, and he as an instrument of the Holy Spirit, got me in the direction of the things that our Lord needed me to do to eventually end up in this place. When I was in college, I did went back to my high school and taught for a year. Did a student teaching under the same teacher. And honestly, my takeaway was that as a matter of discernment, had answered the question for me that I never wanted to be a teacher.
What happened?
Well, I'll tell you what happened. It was pride. I think that, it's an interesting thing that to be a teacher, to be a good teacher, really demands humility, as does the spiritual life, as does our relationship with the Lord and those we love. To be a good parent requires selflessness. To be a good spouse, one has to die to self. And I wasn't there. And so I think that there were some real frustrations on my part as a young teacher that, these people just didn't do what I said and listen, and sometimes, and I wasn't getting the outcomes that I felt like I deserved, and so I would walk away. Some number of years later, maybe 5 years later, after I finished, I was in graduate school and ended up teaching again. It was a little bit of a different experience because then I was teaching college students who had a vested interest in being there and actually wanted to take the classes. But again, I felt a little discouraged by it because what I didn't care for in that And part of that was, for my own sense, is discerning, did I want to be a college professor? Did I want to be a university tenure track professor? And what I didn't care for about it was that the semester I would build a relationship and invest in these people. And then after a semester, they were gone and I didn't see them anymore. And something about that relationally, I didn't care for, didn't sit well. And so I went back to building houses, which is something I had always done. Painting, I was an artist and doing those things. Fast forward, God was working in my life. I was in the adoration chapel, a perpetual adoration chapel one day, and just before the Lord asking him, is this what you want me to do with my life? Is this what you created me for? I feel like I was a good carpenter, contractor, and building houses. I enjoyed it, but I didn't feel fulfilled completely in it, and had some questions. And really quickly, I felt very strongly that the response that came back to me was that I needed to be teaching art in a Catholic high school. And there was only one school, the diocesan Catholic high school at the time. And so the next day, wearing my construction clothes, I just walked through the door, and it really was providence. It absolutely was providence. There was a Franciscan brother that was assistant principal, and it was the strangest thing. It was as though he was waiting for me. I mean, it really was. And then the rest is history. I would end up going there, teaching there for 7 years. Then I worked for the diocese for 3 years before St. Thomas More approached me about becoming headmaster.
And this was all in North Carolina?
This was all here in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay. What I find so fascinating in your answer, Deacon Brad, is that the last interview I did was with Dr. Bernardona, and what he closed his statement with was that really one of the most important things in education is to have good and enthusiastic teachers. And I find it wonderful that you are starting your answer by saying, again, what I hear so often, that when I ask people, why did you feel called to education? It's always a teacher that features big time in the answer. And that's exactly what you're saying. It was your arts teacher who left the seed in you, and here you are finally yourself becoming an arts teacher, and then also becoming a headmaster of a school. So I find it so encouraging and so important, because again, I think it's one of the things we have all learned, me also as a colleague, headmaster of a school, we've all learned that the most important way to reach the kids, the young children, the students, is of course through the teachers and through the persons the teachers are. So I find that a wonderful answer to hear right at the beginning. Yeah. Moving to Jake. Jake, how did you get into education?
Well, it was sort of by accident.
By accident, wow.
Yeah, well, I never really thought about being a teacher so much, but I wanted to go to graduate school and to study philosophy. And the way I paid for it was being a teaching assistant. And once I started to do that, I don't think I was very good at it at first. But once I started to do that, I started to enjoy it. But I also, like Deacon Brad said, valued the potential to build relationships with students and to help them. And I found that rewarding. And then I got a chance to teach some of my own classes there while I was in graduate school after a few years. And I really loved that. And just something about it felt like it was right. I didn't have as powerful a moment as the Adoration Chapel, but I just distinctly remember a day walking between classes in graduate school. I was just about done. And I just thought, this is what God wants me to do. And I didn't know where that was going to be or exactly. I never would have imagined it would be in the Catholic school. I wasn't even Catholic at the time. But yeah, and then when I got as teacher at a couple of different universities, and I had the same experience of getting to know students and caring about their success and their future, but really only having a brief moment with them. And I was more and more convicted that in order to be a true teacher, you've got to be around the students a good bit more, be more invested in them. So I think that here, that's what we're able to do.
What do you teach, Jake?
I teach logic, and I teach bioethics and politics and economics, and then occasionally some electives. But so I will see the students throughout their 4 years here.
And I think you're moving there to, you've actually brought up a very important point, which brings me to the next question. Teaching is relational. It's what both of you have said in your answers is that it's about building the relationship with the pupils. And exactly this is the point where I would like to speak a little bit more about, because the whole idea of starting this series on education at the Crossroads is because through the Corona crisis that we have been living through during the past year now, it's now exactly a year in fact, there is one thing we have seen that has moved with the speed of light, and that is the digitization of education. And we are now seeing a year later, we are seeing the results and the consequences of that. And we all agree there are certain very positive aspects about it, how in times of lockdown and difficulties, some sort of education can continue. But we've also seen that overnight, something has entered into education, which a year ago was almost unimaginable, and which was still a lot of debate about. So for me, this whole development has just been the tip of the iceberg in what education has been going through the past decades. And so my question to you is, looking at where we stand today, with all the challenges ahead of us and the challenges we are currently confronted with in education and in society as a whole, and your experience as teacher, what would you say is currently our biggest challenge in education? And I'd like to ask you to specifically also pay attention to what you have both alluded to, the importance of the relationships with the students so that you can actually teach them.
Well, certainly just to touch back on it quickly is, I mean, ours is a relational faith. We have a relationship with a loving Father and a beloved Son, and the love that is the Holy Spirit, and it comes out of, I mean, our own existence comes out of a relationship, and we're commanded to love God and love our neighbor, and so everything about us is about love and relationships. And so when that gets when we move away from that in any way, I think we're on a path that does not lead us to what is true, good, and beautiful. And so within the church, for example, I mean, as we've talked about the digital aspects of these things, there is something in relationships that must be physical. It's in, I mean, we can't receive the sacraments digitally. And that's something important to recognize in this, that while education is not a sacrament, I think that it relates to the relationship that we have with our Lord in the sacraments, and the way we encounter him in the sacraments is the way that we should encounter one another. I mean, a relationship between a man and a woman in a marriage cannot exist digitally, and you know, it must be, there must be a physical. So I think we always have to keep coming back to that when this is done well and it's done in its most beautifully, is that when it will be a teacher with students in a room, and we can look them in the eye and they can look us in the eye, and they can read the body language and things. And there's things that you can just discern and tell that you can't see when we interface in this way. And that's really important. So there's no question for us that after a year of having at least we finished last year virtually because the state government, shelter at home orders, we had to go digitally. And all of us, students, parents, teachers, everybody felt like while we were grateful for the technology and the ability to do what we could do to keep up their education, it was in no way, it was suboptimal at best. And so we're very glad to be back in person. To your specific question about challenges in education, this is one that I often, we refer to here is the death by 1,000 cuts. And so that it's really difficult to sort of point to one thing or perhaps even a few big things, except that there's a whole lot of pieces that are missing. One thing that I would say without question after 10 years in administration is that every time I have a student that has real struggles in some particular aspect of their life, almost always, without exception, there is a father that is not present to that child in the right ways. I
recognize this so much.
I use those words very intentionally and carefully. A father that is not present to the child in the right ways. So they're either not present, maybe they're just absent entirely for any number of reasons, or they're not present in the right ways. And so that's a huge piece for some of the kids that are really some of the most challenged in different ways. Then it's a human formation issues. It's oftentimes things like sleep, nutrition, and exercise. Are the parents sending to us a child who, humanly speaking, is prepared, is optimal, right? They're well rested. They're not staying up late on technology. They're getting a nutritious, well balanced diet. And they're actually moving and getting exercise, which we know stimulates the brain, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor that helps as the neuroscientists will say is like fertilizer for the brain. And so when we have children who are oftentimes increasingly sedentary and they're playing video games and they're on their technology, they don't go outside, they're not moving, what parents are then doing is presenting to us a child that is not fully capable of receiving what we have to offer. And then I could sort of, go down. Technology would certainly be a challenge in this. Students that don't read, or at least don't read great books, that can be a challenge.
Deacon Brett, I think you are onto something, and I just want to spend a few moments with this point. You started with the fathers, and then you expanded that to the parents in this relationship. And I find it very interesting that you should say that, because in the past 10 years, and also the time before that I've been involved in education, one thing I have so often seen, both at the school level as well as at the university level, is that indeed, when students had problems, the problems could always be led back to us, the parents. And this is, I think, something that is a very bitter pill for us, because, I'm a parent. Deacon Brett, you're a parent. Jake, are you a parent?
Yes.
Yes, so we're all parents here. So we all know that we're not just talking something theoretically, we are talking about our own responsibilities. But it has been my experience, without exception, that when problems with students in the school arise, there is always an issue at home. And indeed, as you spoke about fatherhood, you're really speaking from the heart, because we are both working on the high school level. And it's exactly at the high school age that teenagers need their fathers, because we fathers, in the way nature has been prepared for us, are called to bring our children into the world, to take them by the hand and lead them into the world. And if the father, as you say, is not there or not there in the right way, the children suffer from that. That's quite a responsibility we have, and I find it very interesting that that's the first thing you actually mention, and then going on to of course the various other situations where one can see that it's actually we parents who are not providing for our children in the right way, and the suffering can be seen in that. Jake, would you, from your shorter experience, but all the less important experience, how do you see this, what we're discussing here?
Well, I would say, yeah, I see the same thing in terms of the fathers and just the relationships that they have with adults, and whether the students are peer-oriented or adult-oriented. I think that's peer orientation is a big challenge. And certainly technology and the distractions it poses, big challenge. There's something that we see here a lot, I think, being at a high school. Well, we've started at a middle school, but been a high school, is that students come in so poorly prepared very often. And I don't just mean that their skills in mathematics are behind pace, but they don't read, they don't have conversations. And so all the things that we're asking them to do are just completely foreign. It's not so much that we're taking what they've done and pushing it a little bit further. So we're asking to do something completely different. And I think that, it still can work over the course of 4 years, but I think each year it gets a little bit harder to reach the bulk of the freshman students. And I think that preparation is partly their immersion in technology from the time they're infants, and partly their parents' immersion in technology, so they're more distracted. And I'm sure there's all sorts of factors, but I think also the schooling, just in general, elementary age schooling is not what it needs to be.
Actually, if I could just jump back in and key off that, this is a really, as classical schools, classical schools are about a relationship and then the conversations that happen in that relationship. And one of the things that we've really discerned and realized is that it's a little bit of a challenge, because perhaps like for you, when we're at home, we are having really stimulating and interesting conversations with our children. The dinner time is sacrosanct. Nothing infringes on it. We sit down and we talk about things. We talk about books and maybe movies and other things. And sometimes that moves into debate and even argument or disagreement about something, which is fun. It's fun to see my kids debating about which is the better book, the Iliad or the Odyssey, and then you sort of see whose personalities line up with those books and why. But what we've realized is that for many of our incoming students, that's not the reality, the lived reality of their home. And so when we try to have or engage in conversations with them, we sort of forget that we think that this is what it's like in every home, is that these children are growing up in a home of conversation. Reality is for many of our kids, they eat dinner in their bedroom and the parents are maybe on their devices. And even if they are eating together, they're not having consequential conversations about important matters of the day. They're not discussing politics. They're not discussing life in the church, if that makes sense. And so that's that also is an increasing challenge as students come to us, is they're not prepared for those conversations.
But I think exactly there, you're absolutely right. And I think exactly there, Catholic schools can make such a big difference, and especially classical schools. In fact, one of the feedbacks I get most often from parents, especially those who enter the school at the beginning, is that since their kids have come into our school, the conversations at home and especially at the table have become so lively, and that is a complete new experience for them, because their children are bringing home topics that they have learned and they want to discuss about it and they want to debate about it. And that's often completely new for the parents, because it's a culture that they have not been brought up with. And I find that it always makes me very happy to hear that, because I think, yes, this is exactly where a good classical school should be about. It should be about, bringing, as St. Thomas More said it, is that in education, we want to make visible the treasure that lies hidden, the seed that lies hidden in the heart of the child. And that's exactly what we want to achieve, of course. And it's always, for me, very hope-giving to have this feedback from parents, because we are awakening their children. Because what technology is doing, it's doing the opposite. Technology, their devices, are actually putting them to sleep. I mean, I've seen it myself over the years. And I've seen it also even with my own children, that when there might have been times that we have not been vigilant enough with that, their creativity is immediately put to an end. And we see that also in the school. I mean, we have in our school an absolute zero tolerance policy for electronic devices. Of course, our school has its own computers where they work on for mathematics and computer science and everything. But devices, their personal devices, are not allowed in the school. And but we can still see which are the children who are spending a lot of time on their devices at home, because they tend to be distracted and they tend to be having much more difficulty concentrating. But on the other hand, we see that their creativity in the school, where they're suddenly talking to each other, can bring life again. So I think you're touching there on another essential point, and that is to bring back, this is something very important for us in Catholic education to do, in classical education to do, the combination of the two being the best one, classical and Catholic education, is to bring back the conversations into the families. Now, that being said, what would you, both of you, and I'd be very interested, if you had, so to say, the possibility, let's say you would be a Secretary of Education in the federal government, and you would be given the possibility to select 3 priorities of things that you could change in education, where you think change is very much needed and that could really enhance and improve and strengthen education in the country. What would be the 3 priorities you would choose?
Wow.
It's a big question, I know. What speaks from the heart, I think that's...
Yeah, I think the first thing would have to be somehow addressing the technology. I see this when I drop my kids off at their gymnastics practice, and there are a bunch of little brothers and sisters, 2, 3, 4 years old, sitting around, and all of them are on iPads or phones playing video games. And I just think these children are their brains are rotting already. And I think that if there could be some, whether it's national campaign or something, I don't know. I'm sure if we got the federal government to do it, it would get screwed up pretty quickly. But something to alert people to the real challenges that this poses and the dangers to the kids. I think that would have to be something. And I think also, even when you have young kids, say 5 and 6 years old, who've been on technology a whole lot, they still have curiosity and they still have a sense of wonder. And I think that what we would need to do is begin cultivating that much earlier, with the right kinds of books, the right kinds of projects in school. I think mathematics is important, but there seems to be it seems to be a bit of an idol today.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Education. And so I think that maybe I would de-emphasize the race to get as far ahead as possible in mathematics, and maybe do more reading, get kids involved in conversations, get them doing experiments with things, and cultivate the enthusiasm for learning while there's still some fertile ground there. I think that would be something definitely.
That's two.
That's two. You got one more. I'm waiting. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is the sort of thing that people who will be watching this podcast or interview really want to hear, but I would reiterate what Deacon Brad said about nutrition and fitness. I think that if you start to pay attention to what you see the kids eating or not eating, and you realize that there are so many students who are completely malnourished, and they don't necessarily look it from the outside. But when you see what they're eating for breakfast, they're eating a bag of potato chips for breakfast, and some sugary snacks for lunch, and they get no exercise. And you just think, this cannot be good, not only for their just general health, but for their education. They're not prepared to learn. They don't feel good. They're distracted. They can't concentrate. And I suspect that plays a huge role in some of the declines we see in educational outcomes. And so I think that would be something that would be really important. I think what you're doing there is you're preparing students not only to be good learners now, but you're preparing them to be healthy, flourishing adults when you teach them these things.
Right. So that's three very good points. So just to summarize them: first, a prudent use of electronic devices. Second, not too much of a focus or exclusive focus on mathematics and getting ahead in testing results. And third, paying much closer attention to nutrition. Excellent. Yes, I agree fully with all three you say. I love them. Deacon Brad, now it's yours.
All right.
I had more time to think about it.
That's it. I had the benefit of time.
Right.
My immediate thoughts go to the PPF, the Program for Priestly Formation, which was guided by Pope St. John Paul II. And that really, when we look at the formation of seminarians, we look at four areas: human, spiritual, intellectual, and in the case of the seminarians, pastoral. We convert that a little bit to leadership formation, is the way we would look at it. And so you understand properly that what Pope St. John Paul II was seeing, and I think sometimes people are surprised that when they hear that seminary formation is not firstly spiritual, but it's properly human. And we look to scripture in that Jesus is often very focused on taking care of the human needs of people, and even says that, how can we preach the good news, the gospel, to people who are hungry? We have to feed them first, so that they're not. That's not the issue before we give them the gospel. And so that's where my mind goes, I suppose, with young people. I think in America, I don't know how it is in Austria and how different we have real issues, basically a health epidemic, a crisis in America of, some 60 to 75% of Americans are overweight or obese. What comes with that is a number of metabolic syndromes that make life miserable and very, very difficult to have health and well-being and a sense of fulfillment, and a lot of that stems from being poorly educated or misinformed. And so there is a part of me that thinks when a child is entrusted to us, ultimately as a Catholic classical school, my longest range goal is to help the parents get that child to heaven, to do whatever we can. As Leon Bloy says, the only real tragedy is to fail to become a saint. Right. So that is sort of the longest term. But what I also sort of understand is that from the time we have them at age 14 to the time they leave at, say, 18, What I often talk to them about is the fact that they're on a path, and that there is a unique, particular path that our loving Father is calling each of us to. The challenge is that the devil is going to tempt us off that path on a daily, minute by minute, hour by hour basis. And every little deviation off that path in so many different ways gets us very far apart from doing the will of God and enjoying the life that our Father would have for us, that he wants for us. And what we realize is that parents, as a spiritual work of mercy, is to instruct the ignorant. And while on the one hand, it's very easy to think that, like, well, what we're about is teaching, reading and writing and arithmetic, math and science and these things. So much of what we do in the school is outside of the actual classroom. It's the periods between, it's lunch, it's after school, it's before school. So I really do think, first and foremost, I think that we can't assume anymore that parents are sending us or that they are giving us optimal children. I cannot tell you how many times I've asked students, when did you go to sleep last night? Not go to bed, because oftentimes they go to bed at, say, 8 or 9 o'clock, but then they lay in the bed for 4 or 5 hours on their devices, and they don't go to bed to sleep until 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. When I tell parents that, they're shocked. When I tell them what their own children tell me about when they go to bed, they're shocked because they think they're in their room asleep. So that's we have to take care of the body. I mean, we are body and soul, and this is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And I think that a big piece of that, so I think Jake is right, that sleep, nutrition, and exercise are sort of these three legs of a stool in terms of the child in front of us. Are they optimal? Are they ready to receive what we want to give them? So that would be certainly a first thing. I do think that there is sometimes the need, increasingly, we take for granted, at least we do sometimes here, that students know things. I think we do this in the church too. We begin evangelizing or telling people teachings of the church with the assumption that people know what we're talking about, that they know the terms we're talking about or why. We make sometimes assumptions. And we start talking about things at a high theological level, where really we need to go back to almost philosophy 101 and to sort of prepare the soil for the seeds. And I think that's one of the things we're realizing, as Jake was saying, is that these kids are coming to us oftentimes not prepared to receive an education in the right ways. And that sometimes that means we have to do remediation. In fact, at the school, one of the things we've done is we now spend the first semester of the freshman year. If you imagine in religious life, we have a year of postulancy, where the new brothers and sisters are basically taught how to be a monk or taught how to be a nun. That's kind of what we now do, is we don't assume anymore. We actually teach the students how to be students. At least for us, because in high school, they're coming to us at age 14. So I think that's another thing that, like, sometimes what has been missed is that we assume kids know how to do things like take notes. They don't. We assume they know what words mean. They don't. They have these devices that has, access to an entire dictionary. But when they're reading a book and they come across a word they don't know, they'll just go right past it. And the meaning of the whole passage is lost. I had a group of students that a teacher had spent a couple of weeks during Lent praying Psalm 51 every day. And I went the teacher was out, and I subbed, and I said, well, let's go line by line and do a Lectio Divina here. And I just asked them what words meant. And here they've been praying this for 2 weeks, and they didn't know what words like reproach. What does it mean that, be without reproach, Lord? They didn't know what that meant, so they don't know what the psalm means.
We have to teach the children how to learn.
That's it. And you can't make those assumptions. I think that we make those assumptions in the church that people have been evangelized when they haven't. And we sometimes make the assumption with students that they know how to be a student. And we just start talking and teaching.
Right.
And we're in front of them and don't realize that they may not be prepared for that. I guess as a third thing, I mean, of course, technology is an ever-present challenge and issue, to be sure.
Right.
But I think one of the things to touch back on that Jake mentioned earlier, and he didn't elaborate on it, but this idea of peer orientation is really problematic. Mm-hmm. When we have education systems where we put students together by age group, and then they right. stay in those age groups all the way through, when we lose the idea of an old one-room schoolhouse, or even in homeschooling, mm-hmm. where you have this what we've lost is in many cases is that students no longer look to the adults and the mentors in their lives as the authority figures. We live in an age where everybody's opinion is equal, and in many cases, my friend's opinion is more important or valuable than that of the headmaster of the school, or my teacher, or my priest, or even my parents. And they're turned in on themselves, and we, the adults, are somehow out here in a ring around them. And increasingly, they find us annoying.
But that's also part of teenagers, the development of teenagers.
It is, and so one of the things I think, though, is to try and get them to turn back. Is to turn back and to properly orient. This is not to say we don't value your relationships. In fact, we want them to be deep and meaningful and loving and good. But turn your gaze back to us.
Right.
We do know something, and we love you, and we want to give you good things. So that's also an important piece here as well, that they need to turn back to their parents. Their parents need to matter more to them than their friends. Mm-hmm. And in ways, so don't their teachers and their pastors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To follow on that, we talk about St. John Bosco a lot here, and he said that it's not enough for you to love the kids, but they have to know that you love them. And so this is part of that, building those relationships and sort of pulling them away from the peer orientation, is by establishing your authentic concern for them, and that you know them to some degree. And this is why you mentioned a moment ago the importance of the times outside of the classroom.
Right.
That's exactly right, because you want the kids to trust you and to know that you actually do care about them, and that you understand them. And so often teachers will, I think, prepare classes and think they're thinking about the subject. They're thinking about, I'm teaching a book, or I'm teaching about this period in history or something like that. And they're like, I got all this stuff I want to say. But they're not thinking about the students and how the student's going to receive it, and what the student's prepared for, and what the student cares about. And so I think that something that is critically important is that being very intentional about establishing those relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and there we, because we have already come to the end of our conversation, there we actually come right back to the beginning, because as you started, Deacon Brett, telling about how your arts teacher was the one who, so to say, woke up in you what then later became the teacher and the headmaster. And this is exactly the point to which we're now coming in conclusion. And that is, again, about building the relationship with the students, the human interaction. And that makes me think of an article I recently wrote by one of the US bishops who was being asked about Catholic education. And he made a very good point. He says, if a Catholic school does not have as its primary goal the formation of the souls of the students, then it doesn't really have a right of existence. And he said, we don't need more schools. We just need more schools that take care of the souls of the students. And now, obviously, as Christians, we know that we are called to community, and that this formation of our souls is something that needs to happen in the community, starting with the family, in the church community, and of course in the school, as well as a support of the parents. So I think, so to say, summarizing our conversation, we come back right full circle, and we see that it is this relationship that you described so well, Deacon Brett, of this teacher that really, you know, through his teaching actually woke up something in you. Through the way he dealt with you, we just spoke about outside of the classroom, the conversations on the hallway, you know, the word of encouragement when a student is leaving the school building. You know, it's those moments when, and here I come to my final point, where I think education should be about, and that is all these moments that teach us what it means to be human. And I think with that, we have a good conclusion of our conversation. I want to thank you very much for taking the time. I hope that travel restrictions will soon be lifted so that I can come and visit you again in North Carolina to visit our sister school. And hopefully the same will happen one day, that you can visit us.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation. It's enriching to sometimes do this, to step back and have these have conversations like this, but also to see a good friend again. And we do look forward to the day you'd be back here. And yeah, that would be a joy someday to come and visit Austria. So thank you for this.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
God bless.